A few weeks ago, I posted a video where I ranted a little bit about the big events that we see in comic books and how they never seem to end. It's always one event that is just lead up to something bigger. There's never an end game in sight. Something else I don't like about events is that quite often, and by quite often I mean almost all of the time, you have to read all of the tie-in stuff that, if you read graphic novels and trade paperbacks like I do, isn't collected with the main core event. So if Blue Beetle beats up Kronos in Legends, then he says, "He escaped, but I'll go after him," then you won't see that actually happen in the issues that are collected within the Legends trade paperback. You'll see it happen in the Blue Beetle issues with the Legends banner across the top. So imagine my surprise when I come across a book that at least somewhat seems to avoid all of those problems I have always had with these big events. War of Kings was a 6-issue miniseries in 2009 that featured a war between the Inhumans, who usually are occasional supporting characters in the Fantastic Four comics, and the Shi'ar Empire, an alien kingdom that occasionally shows up in the X-Men comics. Now right now I should clarify something. Remember when I said I don't like how these big events never end? How ever since Avengers Disassembled for Marvel, it's just been one long, dizzying string of big, huge events and crossovers that threaten to change the landscape of the Marvel Universe for good, and they always fail. And what they bring us instead is promises of the next big event that will change the face of the Marvel Universe forever. Yeah, that's pretty much a thing here. This book starts with the Inhumans saying, "We've had enough of this crap." This comes from being treated like dirt in previous stories like Silent War, where the US government treated them like dirt, and then in the Secret Invasion, where they were mistreated by the Skrulls. So the Inhumans decide to start tearing crap up, and their actions result in the war that this book is all about. Then at the end of the book, we have an ominous teaser that, if I'm not mistaken, hints at a conflict that goes down in the Annihilators series that comes sometime after this book. So in a sense, this still suffers from that same thing that causes my weary event fatigue. But where this book differs from, say, Civil War or Secret Invasion or Dark Reign or Fear itself, is that the events from this book feel natural and organic. It makes a lot of sense that the Inhumans would eventually start singing Twisted Sister, whereas about 90% of the big events I read just feel like things that were contrived in order for those events to happen. I can actually believe that Ed Brubaker set up Vulcan as the new Magister of the Shi'ar Empire, and then someone else said, you know, it would make a lot of sense if he rubbed shoulders with this other cosmic side of the Marvel Universe. Maybe there's a story there. Now, before I get too carried away, I should go ahead and briefly talk about the plot of this book before I review it. If you haven't read this story, I will be talking spoilers, so now is your chance to turn back and go read this book if you're interested in what I have to say. So anyway, as I mentioned, the Inhumans decide to go on the offensive against the Skrulls who wronged them in the Secret Invasion. Then they decide to go and take it to the Kree who have wronged them in the past. This results in Ronan the Accuser ceding authority of the Kree Empire to the Inhuman royal family. But on the way to Kreeland, the Inhumans destroyed 3 Shi'ar warships. So the current Magister of the Shi'ar Empire, Vulcan, long story short, he is the evil long-lost half-brother of Cyclops and Havoc of the X-Men, he decides that he is going to war with the Inhumans, who now have the Kree Empire at their disposal. Along the way, various other factions get roped in one way or another. The Starjammers, at this point consisting of about 3 Lost in Space X-Men, the Guardians of the Galaxy, and some jerk named Talon, who looks a whole lot like the 1990s hero Darkhawk. Now, I think this is a good time to clarify something else about this book. Remember how I said most of these big events make the core event virtually unreadable unless you read many of the major tie-ins, either in the form of issues from the main series of some of the main characters, or a mini-series that was created specifically to tie in with the big event? Well, this story almost gets away with not doing that. For one brief fight, a little less than halfway into this story, we see the Guardians of the Galaxy teaming up with the Starjammers to rescue Lilandra. Long story short, she is Professor Xavier's on-again, off-again lover and was the Empress before Vulcan was. Before this, we had not seen the Guardians at all in this story, and after this attempted rescue, we don't see them again. The Guardians are easily the most shoehorned part of this entire story. They don't fit at all, and if this story wasn't written by Dan Abnett and Andy Lanning, who were also writing the Guardians of the Galaxy series at this time, then I would suspect that the writers of 1 did not want the Guardians to show up in this story. But since DNA were both writing this and that, I suspect that there was not any interference from on high. But I could be wrong. And then later in the story, we hear Crystal talk about how the Guardians showed her the future, where the consequences of this war are devastating indeed. If you're only reading this book, as I was, then this might not make a whole lot of sense to you. According to my sources, apparently the Guardians did some weird time travel stuff that was kinda sorta connected to this story, but was almost its own thing that didn't really need to be connected to this or even referenced here. Now, despite this little hiccup in the overall narrative, this book actually does read very well on its own. I haven't really read a whole lot of the cosmic stuff that surrounded this story, and I didn't read the Guardians of the Galaxy book that apparently tied in with this book. But I still think that reading this book by itself will make sense if it is the only thing you're reading. As far as this story goes, we have two characters who are the primary focus of our story. We have Crystal. She is the sister-in-law of Black Bolt, king of the Inhumans. She has apparently been arranged to marry Ronan the Accuser for some time before this story went down. I must say I'm not sure when this development happened. I like the Inhumans quite a bit, and as of Silent War, which wasn't very long before this story, Crystal was still married to Quicksilver, the father of her daughter. I get that, spoiler alert, Quicksilver kinda became public enemy number 1 for the Inhumans, but I wasn't aware that Crystal's marriage to him was annulled or anything like that. Anyhow, shortly after the Inhumans take control of the Kree Empire, Crystal and Ronan are wedded, and we find out around this time that even though this is an arranged marriage that stems from political necessity, poor Ronan actually does love Crystal. This is where my right and left brains clash. Even though I don't believe in love, and I have no idea when Ronan fell in love with Crystal, as I would think that it would have to have been some time before this story began, I still feel my eyes almost tear up when Ronan is about to bring flowers to Crystal, and he hears her telling Polaris that this marriage means nothing, and is just for political convenience. I know nothing about Ronan except that he is an accuser, and I felt really sad for this guy during this part of the story. Now, what does not make much sense to me is that, spoiler, by the end of the story, Crystal seems to think that she is in love with Ronan. Or at least, when Polaris straight up asks her if she has feelings for Ronan, she evades the question, which I can't see why she would do that if she felt the same as she did at the wedding. Now, I'm not entirely sure how much time passes during the course of this book. If it was as long as a normal war, this book could span a few years, but I don't think that's likely, with how slow time moves in any shared comic book universe. I am only going to guess that this story takes a month to unfold, which, even if Crystal spent long hours with Ronan every day of that month, I can only barely accept that she has fallen in love with him when she used to hate his guts, as of the beginning of this story. This weird subplot feels a lot like any given superhero movie, where the superhero stuff takes up about 80% of the movie, and then the romantic subplot takes up about 20%, and doesn't ever feel like it has enough room to breathe, and it always ends up feeling really forced and awkward and not at all real. This story, if it does take several weeks as a war would at the very minimum, has a leg up on a superhero movie that would happen in a much shorter length of time. But I still feel like this kind of romantic relationship should be spread out and be allowed to happen over a slower period of time where romantic feelings, when they arise, will feel more natural and believable. So one of Crystal's arcs is the change in the way she feels about Ronan. Her other arc is handled better. At the beginning of the story, she is kinda whiny and annoying. She keeps complaining about how the Inhumans aren't doing things the way she thinks that they should be done, and admittedly, I will agree that the Inhumans do come across as fairly unlikable here. I get that when life gives you lemons, sometimes you just aren't in the mood for lemonade, and you want to give life some lemons in return. I get that. But the Inhumans are supposed to be the good guys of the story. Even when they kill millions of people who haven't done anything to them specifically, we're meant to say, yep, those are our protagonists. So I actually agree with Crystal. The Inhumans have crossed the line, and that makes me not want to root for them during the rest of the story. The only thing that makes the Inhumans even moderately easy to root for is that the people on the other side of the war are much worse. But whining about it and being annoying in general is not much better than what her family is choosing to do. Now, if you only read the 6-issue War of Kings miniseries, then you would say that Crystal hasn't changed much. At the beginning, she is complaining about things that Black Bolt does. At the end, she takes action to stop Black Bolt from doing anything. But if you go further and read the one-shot War of Kings Who Will Rule, which is also collected in this book, then you have Crystal growing up a little bit and realizing that being part of the royal family means that you have to do things that you don't like. I like this arc for her, as it makes her a little easier to stomach at the end of the book. Our other protagonist is Gladiator. Gladiator is the leader of the Imperial Guard, which is basically the police/soldiers who work for whoever happens to be leading the Shi'ar Empire at the time. We've seen Gladiator work for Dakin, the first emperor of the Shi'ar we, as readers, ever saw. We've seen him work for Lilandra, and as soon as Vulcan took the throne, Gladiator began working for him. This whole idea of someone who works for the government, no matter who the government is being controlled by or what the government does, is kind of interesting to me, because Gladiator is supposed to be an homage to Superman, as the rest of the Imperial Guard are supposed to be homages to the Legion of Superheroes. So you have Superman who, in a post-Watergate world, is very much an agent of truth and doesn't associate with the government or the law of the land very much at all. He did more so before the 1970s. And then you have Gladiator, who is the complete opposite of that. I think that's very cool and could be something that could fuel a character's progression for a long time if he was in an ongoing storyline. But this is also the root of a big problem I had with this book. Gladiator has a very interesting arc here. He goes from being the guy who works for Vulcan, no questions asked, to betraying Vulcan and betraying the Empire because he believes that Lilandra should be put back on the throne. Now, this is a very interesting thing, but it's redundant because we've seen this before. Back in 2002, in Grant Morrison's very divisive run on New X-Men, we saw Gladiator go through a similar arc. Gladiator realized that Lilandra's new advisor was crazy and was psychically manipulating her, and so he and the rest of the Guard went against Lilandra for the sake of Earth. And it didn't take half a year for this arc to unfold either. Gladiator realized he was following others when he should have been taking note of what was happening around him. He says, "Oh, I've messed up. I need to make this right." This was essentially ignored the next time we saw Gladiator and the rest of the Imperial Guard in Ed Brubaker's Rise and Fall of the Shi'ar Empire storyline. There, we spent a year watching Vulcan go from being a psychotic earthbound mutant to taking control of the Imperial throne. And Gladiator, who had already gone through his arc of disobeying the throne for the good of the many, sits back and allows Vulcan to take control. And then flash forward some 3 years later to War of Kings, where, yes, Gladiator goes through this same arc of realizing that his boss is not always right. I like the idea of Gladiator deciding to do what is right and not what is mandated by the law, but do we really need to see him go through this choice multiple times? In 6 years, are we going to see Gladiator once again decide that he needs to disobey the Emperor or Empress in order to do what is right? One thing that we do get here is, spoiler, Lilandra and Vulcan both die in the course of this story, leaving the Shi'ar Empire with no leader. One of the generals surrenders to the Kree on behalf of the entire Empire, and this is when several people seem to think that Gladiator is the best choice to lead the Shi'ar until the Inhumans can decide what to do with the Empire. Gladiator really hates this idea, but when he sees that civil war is going to erupt unless he takes the throne, he does this for the good of the people. Now, this is an interesting take on Gladiator, as he's basically just been used as muscle for whoever leads the Shi'ar ever since his creation. He even mentions this in the story when he says he's just a soldier and he has no business being the leader of an entire empire. And it'd be neat to see him as the leader of the Shi'ar, but as near as I can tell, we don't ever get to see any of that. Gladiator joins the Annihilators, which I know nothing about, but I will hazard a guess and say that it is not about Gladiator being the new Majestor of the Shi'ar Empire. Sometimes we get a really cool idea and you want to see more of it, and instead we see something that doesn't look nearly as cool. Oh well. At the end of the day, I really enjoyed War of Kings. Part of it, I'll admit, is that I had low expectations. I figured, best case scenario, I'll have been out of enough money to get a decent meal, and I could look and see if this thing held up on its own, like I attempted to do with Fear itself. This book isn't perfect, but it has to juggle quite a few characters and stories, and since my familiarity with most of these characters is spotty at best, I thought it did a good job of handling what it did. This book even made me curious about some of the Marvel cosmic stories that happened around this time. But sadly, looking up books like Annihilation or Abnett and Lanning's Guardians of the Galaxy, those books are insanely expensive now, and I'm assuming are out of print. So it's unlikely that I will be able to sate my thirst with more stories similar to this one. But it made me interested, which is more than I can say for many big event books that I read from these big comic book companies. So anyhow, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it informative, and if you did, then I hope you will comment, share, like, and subscribe. And I will see you guys tomorrow with some other kind of video. Until then, be safe, don't do anything I wouldn't do, and I'll see you guys later.